Good morning. Today we are going to talk about revenue models. Hope you are all doing well, staying safe and healthy, and hope you enjoy this lecture. So, revenue models, sometimes I hear the term business model, and it's a little confusing because sometimes when people say business model, they mean the entire lean canvas. In other cases, they're specifically talking about the revenue model, and the revenue model answers the question, how does our venture make money? So we focused exclusively on value creation so far this semester, and there's a reason for that. We want to make sure that if you are launching a venture, that it creates real value for real people. It solves real problems for a real customer segment. But today we're going to shift and we're going to talk about value capture. Without the ability to capture some of that revenue or value, and without the ability to make some money, it's impossible to sustain a venture of any kind. So that's the focus of today's series of lectures. So we're going to begin with a couple of questions. First, who is the customer and who is the consumer? What's our cost structure, fixed versus variable? What happens to our cost during a single transaction? What's our relationship with the customer and consumer, and how will we acquire customers? And we will, in the coming weeks, dig deeper into each one of these things. We'll just kind of touch on them today because they're relevant for picking a revenue model that makes sense for our venture. So let's talk first about the customer versus the consumer. We need to ask, who is my customer and who is my consumer? And let me give you a quick example. So my kids are at home, like many kids right now during the coronavirus stuff. And so they were using an app on their school Chromebooks called Epic. And Epic allows them to read books, to look at books, to listen to books. It's a great way for them to access sort of reading materials while they're at home. However, there's limitations to what they can actually do with their account at home. And so my son was trying to read a book and it kept saying, oh, this feature is locked, talk to a grown-up for help. And then a new window popped up when I said, you click a button that says I'm a grown-up, a new window pops up that says, prove you're a grown-up, what's 11 plus 14 or something like this. And then they want you to purchase a subscription to this app. So in this case, the consumer is my son. The person who's actually going to use the product or service is my son, but the customer is me. And so that's an important distinction to make as you're thinking about your venture. In some cases, the customer and the consumer are the same person. In that case, you don't have to worry about it much. It's fairly simple. But in other cases, you'll have a very distinct customer and consumer. Canvas is another example of this. You are a consumer of Canvas and I am a consumer of Canvas. However, the customer is actually the university. We don't get Canvas for free. Somebody has to pay for it. But you and I, the users, or the consumers, are not the same as the customers because we're not making the purchasing decision directly. So one thing you have to understand as you're designing a revenue model is who's my consumer and who's my customer. What's our cost structure? Now, again, we're going to go into costs fairly deeply in coming sessions, but it's important to at least start to wrap our heads around costs a little bit as we design our revenue model. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite dad jokes. There's a man and he's selling watermelons and he's picking them in his field. He's actually buying them from a farmer. Man, it's the worst when you mess up a dad joke. That destroys the whole thing. But all right, so let's start over. This man selling watermelons. He buys the watermelons for $1 each, puts them in his wheelbarrow, wheels them across town and sells them for $1 each. And he works hard all day long. And at the end of the day, he says, oh, man, I didn't make any money. Maybe I need to get a truck. Right? And the joke is he didn't understand his cost structure. Every time he bought one, he was spending exactly what he made when he sold one. And so he made no money. You need to understand your cost structure. And one of the ways to think about this, and this is just very, very sort of simplistic, back of the envelope kind of, back of the napkin kind of calculation, but think about your fixed versus your variable costs. Fixed costs are going to stay the same, regardless of how much we sell. Variable costs are going to change depending on how much we sell. So I've got a picture of zoo lights there on the bottom of the slide. Zoos have really, really intense fixed costs. You've got large amounts of infrastructure, you've got a whole bunch of animals, And it doesn't matter if nobody is showing up at the zoo or if the entire world is showing up at the zoo. Either way, you're going to have to feed the lion and take care of the elephants and all those things, right? So that the costs stay the same regardless of how many customers are coming to the zoo. On the other hand, you can imagine a scenario where a restaurant has a very lean supply chain and they really only order the food that they're going to need for that day. In this case, their variable costs are going to be pretty high, especially let's say you've got a scenario where you're selling out of a street cart or something and you have almost no infrastructure. Well, what costs are you worried about? You're worried about the cost of the meat and the bun and the pickles, the tomatoes. And if you don't have any customers, it's very simple to stop ordering more ingredients versus if you have a lot of customers, then you just keep ordering new ingredients. And so your costs change very much depending on how much of a particular product you sell. This is important when we design the revenue model, and we'll talk about why in a little more depth. Another thing we have to understand, and this is kind of a different question, but to get at the same kind of core intuition around cross structure, we need to understand what happens during a single transaction. If I go to the zoo, if I purchase zoo tickets for my family and we go to the zoo, what changes from a cost perspective for the zoo? Well, because of the heavy fixed costs, not a whole lot. The costs don't change very much when an additional person buys a ticket to the zoo. On the other hand, if I'm a restaurant, if I serve hamburgers or whatever, and somebody orders 4 hamburgers, well, or 3 hamburgers, as we've got 3 people in this picture, I have to understand that transaction cost me some money. I have to, it's the cost of the meat and the bun and probably some time for my servers. And so I want to think very carefully about what costs do I incur during the transaction. What does that transaction actually look like? What's the interaction and what happens during that single transaction? We also want to think about what's our relationship with the customer. Is this a single transaction? This is a one-time deal. They're going to purchase from us one time? Or is this part of an ongoing relationship? And again, we want to go back to this customer versus consumer kind of distinction that we made before. So I've got a couple of examples here. So one of my sons, my older son, really wanted a football helmet to play with. Not a real football helmet, just a costume football helmet just for playing imaginary football games and with his friends and siblings. And so on eBay, we found a costume football helmet for the Seattle Seahawks, and it was $12. That is likely the only time that I will ever purchase a Seattle Seahawks football helmet, and for sure the only time that I'm going to purchase from that particular vendor on eBay. It was a one-time transaction, and so for that vendor, I'm sure that he priced out that helmet in a way that allows him to make money off of a one-time transaction. On the flip side, Google Play Music is something that I subscribe to. I've built a library in. I don't own any of the songs. It's this ongoing relationship that I have with Google Play Music that allows me to continue to access those goods and services. And then in between, I've got a picture of leaf springs for a pickup truck that I'm in the market for right now. I need to replace some leaf springs. And then a Rick's Motorsport electric. I've bought a handful of products from them, stator and solenoid, and so with Rick's Motorsports or with a car parts vendor, I don't have a subscription. It's not a strong ongoing relationship. But on the other hand, if I found a reliable vendor and I know I can trust them, and I know they're not going to send me, especially for car parts, you want quality parts, right? So if I'm pretty sure that this is a good company, there's a strong likelihood I'll go back to the same vendor and purchase things over and over again. So you could be anywhere on this continuum from a single transaction to an ongoing relationship, or maybe somewhere in between where there's some degree of sort of brand trust or loyalty in the product or service. Finally, we want to think about how are we going to acquire customers? How do these customers become aware of us? How do they engage with us? How do they make purchase decisions? Does it matter if we have a free trial? Does it not matter? Again, we're going to go into a lot more depth on customer acquisition in coming weeks, but you should start to think in these terms because this will have big implications for whether or not you use a freemium model or some other mechanism, and it's tied to the way that you capture value ultimately for your venture. So in the next video, we'll talk about some specific business model patterns, some specific revenue model patterns, ways that you can make money, and we'll apply some of these questions, and we'll think about what mix is appropriate for putting these kinds of revenue models together.